I'm Esther, host of Once Upon a Crime. Last time on Hanged, Ruth Ellis and the Price of Passion. Ruth Ellis was born into hardship, raised in a household marked by poverty, abuse, and emotional neglect. She escaped at her first opportunity. By her mid-teens, Ruth was a single mother navigating post-war Britain on her own, doing whatever it took to survive. At the conclusion of part 1, Ruth was no longer a teenage girl looking for a way out. She was standing at the threshold of adulthood and a darker world, a world run by men like Morris Conley. In part 2, Ruth begins working as a nightclub hostess in London's West End, glamorous on the surface, but underpinned by vice, coercion, and crime. This is where Ruth's life takes a sharp turn, from survival to submission, and from promise to exploitation. This is part 2 of Hanged, Into the Night. It was around 1946 that Ruth Ellis's life took a pivotal turn. After years of trying to carve out her independence, she found herself stepping into the shadowy world of London's nightclub scene, a world teeming with glamour, danger, and secrets. Her first job as a nightclub hostess was at the prestigious Court Club, and it was there she met him, Morris "Maury" Conley. Crime reporter Duncan Webb famously called Conley the monster with the Mayfair touch, a figure who had carved out a dark empire in London's criminal underbelly. Born into a poor Jewish family, Maury Conley had built a reputation as a hardened criminal long before he turned 50. He'd set up a string of illegal ventures, gaming machines rigged to cheat players, and amusement arcades that hid darker activities. He served additional prison time, but by then, he had his sights set on a new empire, nightclubs. His establishments offered jazz, alcohol, drugs, and women. He was no stranger to the criminal underworld. Conley had forged connections with gangsters and gangland figures, using his wealth to buy protection, illegal liquor, and drugs, all on the black market. His hostesses, young naive women, were often as young as 16, many from impoverished backgrounds, and lured by the easy promise of money and a taste of glamour. He blackmailed his hostesses into sex, demanding their compliance with threats and coercion, taking a cut from their earnings and demanding favors, sometimes at the cost of their dignity and their safety. His clientele included wealthy businessmen, MPs, actors, and even members of the royal family. And it was into this world that Ruth stepped, young, ambitious, and eager for a better life. In 1946, Ruth began working as a hostess at the Court Club. As a hostess, her income skyrocketed. Before long, she was pulling in about £20 a week, enough to afford stylish clothes, makeup, and trips to the hairdresser. She became confident, alluring, and increasingly aware of her feminine power in this new world. The club provided her with a taste of luxury she'd once only dreamed of. Ruth's life was changing, and with each new step, she was drawn deeper into London's shadowy, seductive nightlife. But beneath the glamour and the glitter, danger lurked, and Ruth's journey was only just beginning. As Ruth Ellis's journey into London's nightlife deepened, she quickly learned that to survive and thrive in this world, she would have to adapt. She entered into sex work, not out of necessity alone, but as a strategic move to supplement her income and elevate her status. Her goal was clear: to escape the poverty and hardship she'd endured as a child. Ruth had long since closed off her emotions, an armor forged in childhood abuse and heartbreak. She could perform intimacy without feeling, and she enjoyed the attention. Men bought her champagne, gifts, and expensive jewelry. She developed a taste for champagne and silk, luxuries that made her feel glamorous and even powerful. Ruth became a favorite among the clientele, popular, charming, and confident. Every man believed he was her favorite, and she played her role perfectly, acting as if she cared, even though she felt nothing for any of them. For 9 years, Ruth worked for Conley. Over time, she became one of his top employees, training new girls and mentoring them. By age 23, she was a senior figure at the court club, managing staff and earning respect among her peers. In 1950, at just 24, Ruth's life was a whirlwind of nightlife. She was a hostess, an escort, and ran the nightclub operations. Her clients lavished her with clothes, jewelry, dinners, and cash, money that Ruth desperately craved to climb the social ladder. This was Ruth's world, glamorous, dangerous, and filled with secrets. But beneath the glitter lay a dark, hidden truth that would soon threaten to destroy everything she had built. By 1950, Ruth Ellis's life had become one of glamour, gin-soaked nights, and tumultuous relationships. Among the many men she encountered, one became the unlikely focus of the next chapter of her life, George Johnson Ellis. George was known in the West End as the Mad Dentist, a colorful figure. At 48, he was a man of contradictions, a once successful dentist turned into a deeply troubled heavy drinker. Born into a modest family, George married Vera Hume in 1938. She was from an upper-middle-class background, aspiring to be an actress. They had 2 sons, born in 1945 and 1946. But by 1948, George Ellis's marriage was crumbling. Vera left him, unable to endure his excessive drinking and volatile temper. She filed for divorce, accusing him of cruelty. Bitter and depressed, George Ellis spiraled into alcoholism and thoughts of suicide. By 1950, he had quit working altogether, spending his days in bars and clubs, among them the Court Club, where he met 24-year-old Ruth. Ruth learned that Ellis, a Court Club regular, was a wealthy man. She showed him attention, and Ellis soon became infatuated with her. But Ruth was initially dismissive, describing Ellis as pathetic. She made it clear to him she wanted nothing more than a casual acquaintance, refusing to see him outside of club hours. But eventually, after he wouldn't take no for an answer, Ruth accepted a dinner invitation, only to stand Ellis up. But Ruth's attempt to blow the dentist off backfired. That very night, Ellis was assaulted outside the club Ruth sent him to for the planned meetup. He was slashed across the face in a brutal attack after drinking and dancing with a woman who turned out to be the girlfriend of a dangerous gangster. Ellis was rushed to St. Mary's Hospital, where it took 8 stitches to sew up his face. Upon seeing him the next day, Ruth was shocked. Her heart was torn between pity and guilt. She'd heard from her friend Vicky that Ellis had been in a fight, but seeing the serious injury he'd suffered, feeling guilty, she accepted another dinner date from Ellis, and their tumultuous relationship began. Their first date was at George's swanky golf club. Ruth began drinking heavily. That night, she ended up at the Astor Club, drank even more gin, and woke up in Ellis's Sanderstead Hill home. From that moment forward, they were caught in a whirlwind. Ellis showered Ruth with expensive gifts, took her out to fine dinners, and there were always drinks. Unending gin and tonics for George, and fountains of champagne for Ruth. It was a cycle of love bombing and codependence that would soon become even more toxic. George was lonely and still in love with his wife Vera. He longed to reconcile with her and repair his family, but he used his new relationship with Ruth as a way to numb the pain. Their relationship was codependent, utilizing each other for their own needs, with no genuine mutual respect or affection. Ruth later admitted, "He took me shopping, bought me lots of expensive things. I did not get fond of him, only to the extent of what he could spend on me." George took Ruth on a holiday to a luxury hotel in Surrey, and even invited her on a flight in his private plane, a rare privilege at that time. But the flight turned terrifying. George flew the plane upside down without warning, performing dangerous stunts. Ruth later stated, "I have never been so scared in all my life. I thanked God when I landed." After their ruined trip, George took Ruth to his home on Sanderstead Hill, a neighborhood that symbolized stability, something Ruth desperately longed for. When they arrived, George was surprised to find his mother Ella awaiting him. To Ruth's great surprise, George introduced her as his wife, an astonishing lie, but one he felt was necessary. It was a face-saving mood taken to avoid his mother's disapproval. Ellis was haunted by a deep-seated fear of judgment. Since his wife Vera had left him, he'd taken the bizarre step to turn lights on and off in different parts of the house at night so his neighbors wouldn't know his wife and children had walked out on him. The fact that his wife and children left him, in Ellis's mind, only confirmed what he thought others believed, that he was a failure. Ruth, meanwhile, craved true stability. At nearly 25, Ruth felt she was aging out of the club scene. Her youthful allure fading, her aspirations for a better life growing stronger, she saw in George Ellis the stability she desperately needed, and she began to believe that if they both settled down, he could be a good husband, someone who could offer her a fresh start. She also believed that with a husband like George Ellis, she could gain acceptance in the social circles she'd long aspired to be part of. It was for these reasons that even with all the red flags in the relationship, Ruth agreed to marry George, on one condition, that he seek help for his drinking and depression. Surprisingly, he agreed, and in September 1950, checked himself into a psychiatric hospital to begin treatment for alcohol dependence. On November 8, 1950, Ruth married George Ellis at a registry office in Kent. She wore her wedding ring on her other hand. Her lifelong arthritic condition made it impossible for her to wear it on the proper ring finger. A bad omen? Perhaps. The day after their wedding, George returned to treatment at Warlingham Park Hospital. But he arrived at the hospital drunk and belligerent, and during a hazy consultation with his doctor, claimed he'd only married Ruth because she threatened to get a gang to, quote, slash his face again. He falsely accused her of setting him up for the attack that had left him with a scar. Throughout his stay, George's behavior was erratic. He begged for drinks, suffered severe headaches, and slipped into deep depressions. Despite his struggles, he began searching for work as a dental surgeon. In December, he was offered a job at a practice in Southampton, and just after Christmas, he discharged himself from the hospital despite the grim prognosis. The doctor's notes describe Ellis as a chronic alcoholic with a narcissistic personality and recorded his likely outcome as, quote, not good. In 1951, George began his job at the new dental office. At first, Ruth tried to build a new life, becoming a housewife and mother and hoping for the best. But George's drinking resumed, and his jealousy and possessiveness grew. Ellis would get drunk, become controlling, and sometimes violent. Ruth found herself increasingly isolated, away from London, her friends, and her family. George promised to stop drinking, but he secretly continued to, missing work, returning home belligerent, and accusing Ruth of infidelity. Ruth's own suspicions grew. She had her husband followed and spied on women she believed he was seeing behind her back. Their fights turned violent. George was physically abusive, grabbing Ruth by her hair, banging her head against the wall, kicking her, and leaving her bruised and bloodied. She left him more than once, seeking refuge with her family, but Ellis would call relentlessly, coercing Ruth to return to him, where she remained trapped in a cycle of violence. In May 1951, George was fired from his dental practice for frequently missing work. Yet the chaos persisted. Ruth was pregnant again. Even during her pregnancy, alcohol and fighting defined the couple's days. George called his pregnant wife a bloody bitch from Brixton. In turn, Ruth called him a drunken old has-been from a lunatic asylum. The couple went on holiday to Wales, but their fights escalated. Ruth finally admitted their marriage was beyond saving. She returned alone to London, 4 months pregnant, a mother of a 6-year-old, with no job and no money. George Ellis was readmitted to Warlingham in June in a dire state. Weak, agitated, confused, and trembling after months of heavy drinking, the doctors at Warlingham observed that Ellis exhibited early signs of paranoid alcoholic dementia. Throughout his stay, he frequently voiced accusations against Ruth, claiming she was pathologically jealous and that her behavior was designed to ruin him. He insisted that she continued to make unfounded claims, alleging affairs with nurses and hospital staff, and that her suspicions were the root of his downfall. "She's always watching," he would tell the doctors, "trying to catch me in something." The hospital staff, however, saw no evidence to support George's allegations. The administrators attributed his suspicions to his confused mental state, suggesting that his paranoia was a symptom of his alcohol-induced dementia. Yet as time passed, some of George's claims would gain credibility. In a review of his earlier patient records, a witness's account surfaced, revealing that Ruth had been observed to be, quote, "on constant watch," frequently checking in with staff, patients, and visitors to monitor her husband's activities. One male nurse noted that it was common knowledge among staff that Ruth appeared to be continually scrutinizing George's interactions, perhaps driven by her intense jealousy. These claims remained largely anecdotal and unverified at that time. George, meanwhile, maintained that his wife's jealousy was pathological and had fueled his paranoia and contributed to his fragile mental state. The truth, as it often is in such tangled stories, was difficult to untangle, leaving the he said, she said dynamic at the heart of their accusations. Ruth Ellis gave birth to their daughter, Georgina Jane, on October 2, 1951. The birth was complicated, and Ruth was prescribed potent sedatives. Postpartum depression took hold, and her mental health suffered. George was released from the hospital about a month later. The dissolution of the marriage between George and Ruth was already in motion. Ruth Ellis returned to London, where she tracked down Morris Conley at his club, which had been newly refurbished and given a new name, Carol's. Living in a flat on Oxford Street, Ruth worked long hours entertaining wealthy patrons, bankers, businessmen, and even a Canadian oil magnate. Her life was a cycle of work and the constant need to charm new clients. However, Ruth Ellis was never content to merely survive. She was looking for the next opportunity to thrive. And in 1953, Ruth would meet a new man with whom she'd pin her hopes and dreams on, David Blakely, a reckless, charming race car driver whose passion for speed, both on and off the racetrack, would ignite a love affair with devastating consequences. Join me next week for part 3 of Hanged, Ruth Ellis and the Price of Passion. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell to be notified whenever I upload a new video. If you'd like to hear the entire audio version of this episode, listen to it on the Once Upon a Crime podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and wherever you find podcasts. You can find all our episodes, as well as get links to our social media channels on our website, truecrimepodcast.com.